The diner was nearly empty, save for the occasional late-night straggler. The warm glow of neon lights flickered outside, casting eerie reflections against the rain-slicked pavement. Inside, the hum of the coffee machine filled the silence, interrupted only by the clatter of silverware and the muffled voices of the few remaining customers. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the clock. 1:47 a.m. Another long shift was coming to an end, and exhaustion weighed on her like a heavy coat. She had been working double shifts for weeks, barely scraping by, yet she still managed to offer a tired smile to every customer who walked through the door. Tonight, though, something felt different. There was a presence, an unsettling awareness that made the tiny hairs on her arms rise. The bell above the door chimed softly, and she turned to see an elderly man step inside. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed, and his posture slightly hunched. He hesitated near the entrance before shuffling toward the farthest booth in the corner. Emma grabbed a menu and approached him. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything?" The man looked up, his gray eyes dull yet filled with a quiet sorrow. "Just a coffee, if that's all right." His voice was rough, like someone who hadn't spoken much in a long time. Emma noticed the way he kept his hands folded tightly on the table, as if he were trying to make himself as small as possible. Something about him struck her. Maybe it was the tired way he held himself, or the deep lines of struggle etched into his face. She offered him a warm smile. "Of course, but how about something to eat?" "It's on me." The man hesitated, his lips parting as if to refuse. But then he simply nodded. "That's very kind of you." Emma didn't think much of it. She had seen people like him before, those who had fallen through the cracks of life, ignored by the world around them. It wasn't much, but a warm meal and a little kindness could make a difference, even if only for a night. She placed an order for a hearty breakfast plate, the kind that would keep someone full for hours. When she brought it to him, his hands trembled slightly as he picked up the fork. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if he hadn't had a real meal in days. "Thank you," he murmured after a while, barely looking up. Emma simply nodded. "No problem at all." She busied herself with wiping down the counters and refilling the salt shakers, but every now and then she stole a glance at the man. Something about him nagged at her. He wasn't just a homeless drifter. There was a weight in his eyes, an emotion deeper than mere hardship. As the night dragged on, the diner grew even quieter. Eventually, the man finished his meal and placed a few crumpled bills on the table. It wasn't enough to cover even the coffee, but Emma didn't care. She'd already decided she wouldn't charge him. As she cleared his plate, she noticed something tucked under the coffee cup. A napkin, folded neatly, with a message scribbled in careful handwriting. "Kindness is rare. You may not know it yet, but you have changed a life tonight. Thank you." She stared at the words, a strange unease settling in her stomach. When she turned back to where the man had been sitting, the booth was empty, the door hadn't chimed, and she hadn't seen him leave. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Something wasn't right, and for the first time that night, Emma felt like someone was watching her. Emma stood frozen, staring at the napkin in her trembling hands. The words scribbled on it sent a chill down her spine. "Kindness is rare. You may not know it yet, but you have changed a life tonight. Thank you." She looked around the diner, her pulse quickening. The old man was gone. The booth where it sat was empty, yet she hadn't heard the door chime. Had he slipped out unnoticed, or had she been too distracted to see him leave? Shaking her head, she tucked the napkin into her apron pocket. It was late, and exhaustion was making her paranoid. Maybe he just didn't want to be seen leaving. Homeless people often preferred to disappear quietly. Still, the uneasy feeling in her gut didn't go away. The bell above the door jingled again, making her flinch. A lone customer stepped in, a middle-aged man in a dark coat. He barely glanced at her as he took a seat at the counter. Emma took a breath, forcing herself to shake off the nerves. "Evening. What can I get you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted his coat, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "Just coffee," he finally said. His voice was deep, unreadable. Something about the way he watched her made her uneasy, but she gave a quick nod and turned to pour the coffee, her hands gripping the pot a little too tightly. As she placed the cup in front of him, she caught a glimpse of something, his hand, partially visible beneath the coat sleeve, covered in faint scars. He stirred his coffee in silence, watching her as she moved around the diner, tidying up. Minutes passed, stretching uncomfortably. Finally, he spoke. "Busy night?" Emma hesitated before answering. "Not really. Just a few customers." The man nodded, his expression unreadable, like the old guy sitting in the corner earlier. Her breath caught in her throat. She forced herself to stay calm, wiping down the counter to keep her hand from shaking. "Yeah," she said carefully. "He came in for coffee. I gave him something to eat." The man's gaze didn't waver. "That was nice of you." Emma swallowed. Why is he asking about the old man? She forced a small, polite smile. "Just doing my job." The man took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup down. "And what if I told you that old man wasn't who you think he was?" Her stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" She kept her voice steady. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Did he leave you anything?" Emma's fingers instinctively brushed against a napkin in her apron pocket. How did this man know? She hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully. "Just a note. Nothing important." The man's eyes darkened. "May I see it?" Emma took a small step back. "Why?" The diner suddenly felt too quiet, the air thick with tension. The man exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the counter. "Look, I know this seems strange, but that man, he wasn't just a drifter. And if he left you a note, it means something. I need to see it." Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. This was getting weirder by the second. Who was the old man? And why was this stranger so interested in him? Her instinct screamed at her not to trust him. She reached into her pocket, gripping the napkin tightly. But she didn't pull it out. Instead, she took a step back. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "All right," he said. "If you change your mind, be careful." He pulled out a few bills and placed them on the counter, finishing his coffee in one long sip. Then, without another word, he stood and walked toward the door. Emma watched him go, her skin crawling. The bell jingled as he stepped out into the night, disappearing into the darkness. She let out a shaky breath, then quickly locked the door. Something wasn't right. First, the old man's eerie note. Now, this mysterious stranger asking questions. And that wasn't even the worst part. As she turned off the lights and grabbed her things, she glanced outside just to be sure the man was gone. And that's when she saw it. Across the street, standing perfectly still beneath a broken street lamp, was a figure, watching her. A shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't see their face, but she knew, whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. They were waiting for her. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. The figure stood motionless beneath the flickering street lamp, their face obscured by shadow. The cold night air seeped through the glass as she pressed her hand against the locked diner door, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Who was that? The man from earlier? Someone else? For a moment, neither of them moved. The street was empty, the silence thick with an unspoken threat. Then, slowly, the figure took a step forward. Emma gasped and stumbled back, her heart racing. She fumbled for her keys, hands shaking as she struggled to shove them into her bag. "Don't panic. Just go home." When she forced herself to glance back at the street lamp, the figure was gone. The empty sidewalk sent a fresh wave of unease through her. She squeezed her eyes shut, took a deep breath, and rushed to her car. The night had taken a turn she didn't understand, and she had no intention of sticking around to find out what came next. Emma's tiny apartment was no sanctuary. She double-checked the locks twice before collapsing onto her couch, still clutching the napkin in her fist. The old man's words played over and over in her mind. "You may not know it yet, but you have changed a life tonight." What did that mean? Who was he? And more importantly, why was someone else looking for him? The exhaustion from her shift should have knocked her out, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure beneath the street lamp, standing completely still, watching. Sometime past 3 a.m., her phone buzzed. Emma nearly jumped out her skin. She hesitated before picking it up. The screen flashed unknown caller. Her thumb hovered over the decline button. Who the hell will be calling at this hour? Against her better judgment, she answered, "Hello." At first, there was only silence. Then, a raspy voice whispered, "You should have given him the note." Emma's entire body went rigid. The call cut off. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She could barely breathe. Who was that? How did they know? Her apartment suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. She leapt to her feet and checked the windows. The curtains were drawn, but paranoia clawed at her. Someone was watching. They had to be. Her hands shook as she called the only person who came to mind, Detective Harris, a cop she'd met months ago when a drunk customer got violent at the diner. He had given her his number in case she ever needed help. Right now, she needed help. It rang. Once. Twice. Then, a click. A deep voice answered. Groggy. "Harris." "Detective, it's Emma." I think someone is following me." Silence. Then the rustle of sheets as he sat up. "What happened?" She clutched the phone tighter, forcing herself to sound calm. "A strange man came to the diner, asking about an old man I served tonight. Then, when I got home, I got a call from someone who knew about a note he left me." Harris was quiet for a long moment. Then his voice sharpened. "What did the note say?" Emma hesitated. How much should she tell him? It just said I had changed a life tonight," she finally admitted. Another pause. Then, "Emma, listen to me. Where's the note now?" She swallowed. "I have it." "Don't lose it," Harris said, his tone serious. "And don't trust anyone looking for it. Can you send me a picture of it?" Emma grabbed the napkin from her pocket, hesitating. It was just a few scribbled words. Why did it feel like something much bigger? But before she could answer, a loud thud came from her front door. Her breath hitched. The phone nearly slipped from her grip. "What was that?" Harris asked immediately. Emma's pulse thundered. She crept toward the door, pressing her eye against the peephole. Darkness. Then a single knock. "Emma?" Harris's voice was sharp now. "Is someone there?" Emma's fingers hovered over the lock. The peephole showed nothing, but her instinct screamed that someone was out there. Then something slipped under the door. A plain white envelope slid through from the other side. Emma stumbled back, her breath shaky. "Emma?" Harris was still on the line. "Talk to me." She bent down and hesitantly picked up the envelope. No name, no markings. She tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single slip of paper, written in the same shaky handwriting as a napkin. But this time, the message was different. Don't trust him. He is not who he says he is. Emma's blood ran cold. She clutched the phone. "Detective, I think you need to come over." Harris didn't hesitate. "Stay inside. I'm on my way." But as Emma stood there, staring at the note in her trembling hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just walked into something far bigger than she could ever understand. And someone, maybe more than one person, wanted to make sure she never found out the truth. Emma paced the length of her small apartment, heart pounding with every second that passed. The note in her trembling hands was proof that this wasn't just paranoia. Someone was watching her. But the message it carried was even more unsettling. Don't trust him. He is not who he says he is. Her eyes flicked to her phone, where Detective Harris had promised he was on his way. She didn't know what scared her more, the idea that someone was outside her door, leaving cryptic messages in the middle of the night, or the growing suspicion that she was caught between two forces that she didn't understand. A sudden noise outside made her flinch, tires crunching against gravel, headlights flooding through the thin curtains. Harris had arrived. Emma barely hesitated before unlocking the door and yanking it open. Detective Harris stepped out his car, scanning the dimly lit street before fixing his sharp gaze on her. "Get inside," he ordered. She obeyed without question, locking the door the second he stepped in. The apartment suddenly felt smaller with his presence. His broad frame filled the tiny space. But it wasn't just his size that made her uneasy. It was the way he studied her, like he was assessing her. "Show me the notes," he said. Emma hesitated for only a moment before handing over the napkin and the envelope. Harris took them, reading both messages with a blank expression. Then he looked at her. "Who else have you told about this?" "No one," she admitted. "Just you. Good." He exhaled sharply. "You did the right thing calling me." His words should have been reassuring. They weren't. Emma folded her arms. "What's going on, detective? Who was that old man? And why would someone warn me not to trust you?" For a moment, Harris didn't answer. Instead, he ran a hand over his jaw, as if deciding how much to tell her. Then he sighed. "I need you to trust me, Emma. What I'm about to tell you, it doesn't leave this room." Emma's stomach twisted, but she nodded. Harris lowered his voice. "That old man you served tonight? His name is Henry Calloway. And for the last 30 years, he's been living under a different identity." Emma's brows furrowed. "Why?" "Because he used to work for people who don't forgive mistakes," Harris said grimly. She swallowed hard. The man looking for him at the diner, was he one of them? Harris's expression darkened. Most likely. Emma's pulse quickened. What did Henry do? Harris hesitated. Then, finally, he said he used to work for a powerful man. A man who trusted him with something very dangerous. And when Henry tried to get out, he disappeared. Emma's hands felt clammy. And now he's back. Harris gave a slow nod. He made a mistake showing himself. And you got caught in the middle of it. Emma's head spun. She had served Henry a coffee and a warm meal, never realizing she was helping someone on the run from something much bigger than she could imagine. Then a thought struck her. "The note said I'd change a life tonight," she whispered. Was he talking about himself? Harris studied her. Maybe it was a warning. Emma's mind raced. "You said he used to work for a powerful man. Who?" Harris was about to answer when something slammed against the apartment door. Emma nearly screamed. Harris moved fast, drawing his gun and gesturing for her to stay back. Another bang. Then silence. Emma barely breathed. Harris crept toward the door, gun raised. He reached for the doorknob, then suddenly turned to her. "Go to the bedroom," he whispered. "Now." Emma hesitated, but the look in his eyes sent her running. She locked herself inside, heart hammering against her ribs. The walls were thin. She could hear Harris breathing heavily outside. Then, the sound of the front door creaking open. A stranger's voice, low and calm. "You're getting too close, detective." Emma's blood turned to ice. Harris didn't respond right away. Then she heard his voice, quiet but firm. "She's got nothing to do with this. Let her go." The stranger chuckled. "Oh, but she does now." A pause. Then, "Henry left something with her, didn't he?" Emma's breath hitched. "What?" Harris didn't speak, but his silence was enough of an answer. The stranger exhaled. "Well, that's unfortunate." Then, the crack of a gunshot. Emma's whole body jerked as the sound shattered the silence. A thud followed. Then footsteps. Slow, steady, moving toward her door. Emma's hand clamped over her mouth to keep from screaming. The handle turned. She scrambled backward, heart slamming into her ribs. Nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. The stranger knocked once. Then his voice came through the door. "Emma." She bit down on her lip, so hard she tasted blood. "I know you have it," the voice continued. "The napkin? The note?" She didn't understand. The man outside the door sighed. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." The lock rattled. "Open the door, Emma." She squeezed her eyes shut. "Or I will." Emma pressed her back against the bedroom wall, her breath shallow, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst. The stranger outside her door jiggled the handle again, his voice eerily calm. "Open the door, Emma. I won't ask again." Her hands fumbled against the nightstand, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. A lamp, a book, a glass of water. Useless. Then a sharp sound, the unmistakable crack of splintering wood. The lock gave way. Emma sucked in a breath as the door swung open. A man stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim apartment light. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing. His eyes scanned the room, landing on her immediately. "You don't need to be afraid," he said. His voice was steady, controlled. "I just want what Henry left with you." Emma's mind raced. "Henry? What had he left?" I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. The man tilted his head. "I think you do." He took a step forward. Emma pressed herself tighter against the wall. From the other room, she could still see Detective Harris slumped on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. He wasn't moving. Panic clawed at her throat. She had no options, no one to call for help, unless... Her eyes darted toward her bag. The napkin, the note, was that what they were after? She swallowed hard. If Henry had given her something valuable, she needed to think fast. The man took another step forward. "Henry trusted you with something, Emma. You may not realize it yet, but I need it. Now." Emma's hand inched toward the nightstand drawer where her phone was tucked away. If she could just... "Don't," the man warned. "No sudden moves." She froze. His eyes darkened. "I don't want to hurt you, but if you make this difficult..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. She understood. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, carefully, Emma spoke. "If I give it to you, will you let me go?" The man's lips curled into a small smile. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether or not you've already seen what's on it." A chill ran through her. Her mind scrambled. What's on it? The napkin, the note, Henry's words. Had she missed something? Then it hit her. Henry had handed her the napkin so casually, almost like a habit. But what if... Her pulse spiked. What if the napkin wasn't just a napkin? Emma's hand shook as she reached into her bag and pulled out the crumpled napkin Henry had left behind. The man's eyes locked onto it immediately. "Open it," he ordered. Emma's fingers trembled as she unfolded it. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary napkin, marked only by Henry's shaky handwriting. "You changed a life tonight." But now, she looked closer. The texture felt off, too thick. She hesitated, then carefully peeled at the edges. A second layer came loose. And underneath, ink, hidden writing, barely visible under the dim light. The man's breath hitched. "There we go," he murmured. "Now hand it over." Emma's eyes scanned the writing. The letters were small, hurried, but she could make out certain words. Account numbers, offshore, insurance, blacklist. Her breath caught. This wasn't just some message. It was evidence. Henry hadn't been just anyone. He had been a whistleblower. And whatever was on this napkin, it was dangerous. Emma's fingers clenched. The man took a step closer. "Give it to me, Emma." She hesitated. Then, bang, a gunshot. Emma screamed. The man staggered, his hand flying to his shoulder. Blood spread through his jacket. From behind him, Detective Harris, struggling to his feet. Still alive, his gun wavered, but his eyes burned with determination. "Run," he rasped. Emma didn't think twice. She bolted past the wounded man, her legs shaking as she stumbled into the living room. Harris fired another shot, forcing the intruder to retreat. "Get out," Harris gasped. "Now!" Emma grabbed the napkin and sprinted for the door. She didn't look back, didn't stop running until she was outside, her feet pounding against the pavement. Somewhere behind her, tires screeched. A car sped off into the night. She kept running. By the time the police arrived, Emma was shaking uncontrollably. Harris was taken to the hospital, barely conscious but alive. The intruder had vanished, and the napkin? It was now in police custody. As dawn broke over the city, Emma sat on the edge of an ambulance, staring at her hands. She had only been trying to be kind, but somehow she had ended up in the middle of something much, much bigger than herself. A crime, a conspiracy, and a man named Henry Calloway, who had trusted her with a secret that had almost cost her life. As she sat there, exhausted, the reality of it all sank in. Her life would never be the same.